with Islam. But there is a clear distinction between Islam as religion and the figure of Muslim woman who belongs to the culture in which she is placed. In India, in context, it is of course India. And secondly, they are not very different very often from the issues that other women face, except for the fact that these women belong to Muslim community. We have three excellent scholars. And in fact, like him, she was a discovery to me. We live in Jamia, but we are not familiar with brilliant work of our colleagues. So I'm really delighted to welcome three excellent panelists to this session. Professor Azra Abidi, Dr. Yasser Arafath, PK Yasser Arafath, and Dr. Borker. Azra, of course, is a colleague. She is heading the sociology department, but she's a scholar in her own right, and I know her in many other roles. Azra, over to you. Azra is going to talk about. Let me read Azra's title. Okay.
Thank you so much. Professor Nishat Zaidi, Dr. Amina Hussain, and dear panelists and colleagues, students present here. Thank you so much and good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum. It's a privilege to be a part of this international conference, which is related to our specialization. And since I am working in not only women in India, so I have selected my presentation with reference to South Asian Muslim women. So I will discuss in my presentation about faith, gender, and power. Rethinking Muslim women's political presence in South Asia. So within a limited time, I will try to sum up my presentation, though I have prepared a very long presentation, but I will try to sum up within 10 to 12 minutes as well. The question which is related to Muslim women's political presence in South Asia has often been framed in narrow and simplistic ways. Much scholarships and public discourse tend either to portray Muslim women as silent victims constrained by religion and family, or they highlight they feel exceptional figures and call that empowerment. Both approaches are incomplete and misleading. In reality, Muslim women across South Asia have navigated layered worlds shaped by faith, culture, community, and patriarchy. Within these spaces, they have demonstrated endurance, negotiation, leadership, and political agency in forms that are both visible and subtle. To understand Muslim women as political actors, we must move beyond formal institutional politics. Their presence cannot be measured only by representation in parliaments or party offices. It must also include community mobilization, struggle, decision making in families and neighborhoods, leadership in reform movements, struggles around education, and everyday acts through which they challenge restrictive norms. Their politics often emerge from lived experiences, quite steady, resilient, and deeply embedded in daily life. Muslim women have been active contribution to social and political life long before the formation of modern nation states. Early Islamic history offers examples of women who were scholars, traders, orators, caretakers of public welfare, and close companions of Prophet Muhammad. When Islam reached South Asia, its teachings were interpreted alongside local cultural practices, sometimes expanding women's spaces and sometimes narrowing them. Across the subcontinent, we find Muslim women not only in domestic roles, but also as influential figures in governance, education, literature, and the public leadership. In the welcome address, Professor Nishat already mentioned the names of more important female personalities. They have participated in different activism as well as in independence movement as well. So I'm not going to add that one. I am coming to the theoretical perspective that is very important to understand how can we place these Muslim women in South Asian political spaces. And if you look, different feminist approaches help to understand the diverse ways Muslim women exercise agency. First, liberal feminist discourse that emphasizes equality and rights. Another is Islamic feminist thinkers such as Amina Hussain read sacred texts to argue for women's dignity and spiritual dignity, equality. Post-colonial feminists like Saba Mahmood and Leela Abu Lugud caution against applying Western notions of freedom as the only measures of agency. Dennis Candiotti's concept of bargaining with patriarchy, quote unquote, highlights that women negotiate, adapt, resist, and strategically navigate patriarchal expectations rather than simply accept or reject them. These frameworks remind us that agency is not only loud and confrontational, it can be quite strategic, relational, and rooted in lived faith. I will give some examples in support of my argument. In India, Muslim women face intersecting pressures of class inequality, communal politics, and patriarchal norms. Yet movements like Shaheen Bagh showed how women reclaim public space through Quranic ethics, constitutional consciousness, and peaceful collective presence. Local body elections and community-based organization continue to create new sites of leadership for Muslim women. In Pakistan, another example that reflects both empowerment and constraint, while women have reached the highest political offices, patriarchal custom persists, including practices such as karokari and hak bakshi and jirga imposed punishments. Laws such as the Criminal Law Amendment Act 2016 aim to curb honor killings, but implementations remain uneven. Groups like Women's Action Forum have played transformative roles in legal and policy reforms in Pakistan as well. Another example is from Afghanistan. Afghan women's struggle is both painful and courageous. Under current Taliban rule, their public presence is restricted, yet their resistance endures through underground schools, covert teaching networks, digital solidarity, and exilic writing. The poetry of Nadia Anjuman gives voice to their suffering and resilience. So I will quote some lines from this poem as well. And she has written in her poem that खामोश हूँ मगर दिल में तूफान बहुत है. She has expresses her pain. खामोश हूँ मगर दिल में तूफान बहुत है. ये जंजीर तो टूटी नहीं, अरमान बहुत है. घरों की दीवारों में दबी चीखें रवां हैं. ये कैसी जिंदगी है, ये कैसा समा है. कलम पकड़ लूं तो मुझ पर कहर बन जाता है सब. मेरी आवाज से डरता हुआ एक जहां है. मैं लिखना चाहती हूँ, मैं बोलना चाहती हूँ, मगर मेरे लफ्जों पे पहरा लगा हुआ है. खामोश हूँ मगर दिल में तूफान बहुत है. ये जंजीर तो टूटी नहीं, पर अरमान बहुत है. Their silent defense preserves hope for a future yet to emerge. Bangladesh has seen women in the highest political offices like Sheikh Hasina, Khalida Zia, Matia Chaudhry, Dimpu Moni, Sahara Khatun, and civil society leader Jahan Ara Imam. Yet everyday women continue to face unequal inheritance, mobility restrictions, and limited decision-making power in party structures. Grassroots networks in health, education, and cooperatives have enabled ordinary women to shape change, though their contribution often remain invisible. In Sri Lanka, women such as Ferial Ashraf and Ferial Abdul Qadir have contributed to formal politics, while activists like Sherin Saroor and Safia Deen are central to reforming discriminatory marriage and divorce laws. Their work shows how political actions often begin in homes, mosques, legal forums, and neighborhood collective rather than in legislation. Across South Asia, Muslim women today negotiate both internal patriarchy and external state and societal pressure, resulting in a dual burden of cultural expectations and political marginalization. Yet this movement is also marked by renewed intellectual, legal, and civic leadership. Women scholars, journalists, counselors, religious educators, and peace builders are shaping discourse and community features, often without public recognition. To see Muslim women only as a symbol is to ignore their voices. To recognize them as thinking, striving, creative agents is to acknowledge their full humanity. In the present context, Muslim women encounter a layered set of constraints, and I have mentioned that communal polarization that also influence the symbolic burden placed on their bodies as markers of identity, honor, and authenticity. Within communities, patriarchal authority continues to limit access to decision making. Patriarchal authority continues to limit access to decision making spaces in religious and familial institutions. Additionally, debates on personal laws and state intervention frequently position Muslim women between state power and community defensiveness, generating ambivalence around reform. In conflict affected regions, especially Afghanistan, the curtailment of mobility, education, and speech demonstrate how gender become a key site of political control, though resistance persists in covert and intellectual forms. So I am looking towards the way forward. So I can mention here that strengthening Muslim women's political presence requires recognizing forms of agency, grounded in faith and communal belonging, rather than assuming Western liberal models as the only norm. This involves expanding women access to religious scholarship and interpretive authority, fostering educational and digital networks that build intellectual autonomy, enabling leadership in local governance and community institutions, and supporting economic participation that is dignified, socially rooted, and safe. Most importantly, reform must emerge through dialogue engagement where women's voices, experiences, and interpretive capacities become central to defining community future. Muslim women are not passive carriers of tradition, but active producers of meaning, memory, and moral imagination. Their political presence lies not only in occupying public space, but in shaping how faith, community, and citizenships are lived and reimagined. So I want to conclude my presentation with a poem that was written by Dr. Fatima Hassan. She is a very well-known feminist, a scholar and poet from Pakistan. And in her poem, Aurat, she has mentioned and she has challenged social assumptions about women's identity and existence. So she has very well written in this nazm. I will recite few lines of this nazm Aurat. She says, basically there is a traditional approach to look towards women or towards their femininity as that. So she has challenges that kind of approach. So she mentioned in this poem Naz, तो तीन चार उसके अशार मैं यहाँ पढ़ दूं कि वो लिखती हैं कि आंखों में न जुल्फों में न रुखसार में देखें. Generally, there is an approach to see a woman. या तो उसकी जुल्फों की तारीफ होती है या उसके रुखसार की तारीफ होती है या उसकी पूरी शख्सियत की तारीफ होती है ब्यूटी के कॉन्टेक्स्ट में. तो शी सेज कि आंखों में न जुल्फों में न रुखसार में देखे, मुझको मेरी दानिश मेरे अफकार में देखे, मलबूस बदन देखे हैं रंगीन कबा में, अब पैर रहने जात को इजहार में देखे, पूरी न अधूरी हूँ न कमतर हूँ न बरतर, पूरी ना अधूरी, पूरी कंप्लीट वुमेन, जननी का जो कॉन्सेप्ट है कि इनफर्टिलिटी इनकम्प्लीट वीमेन, पूरी ना अधूरी हूं ना कमतर हूं ना बरतर, इंसान हूं इंसान के मेयार में देखे, रखे हैं कदम मैंने भी तारों की जमी पर, रखे हैं कदम मैंने भी तारों की जमी पर, पीछे हूं कहाँ आपसे रफ्तार में देखें। मंसूब है इंसान से जितने भी फजाइल, अपने ही नहीं मेरे भी अतवार में देखें। और शी सेड कि कब चाहा कि सामान्य तिजारत हमें समझे, कब चाहा कि सामान्य तिजारत हमें समझे, लाए थे हमें आप ही बाजार में देखें। इस कादिर मुतलक ने बनाया है मुझे भी, उस कादिर मुतलक ने बनाया है मुझे भी, और तामीर की खूबी उसी मेमार में देखें, तामीर की खूबी उसे मेमार में देखें। तो थैंक यू सो मच टू प्रोवाइड मी दिस अपॉर्चुनिटी। थैंक यू सो मच।
Thank you so much, Professor Azra. That was very interesting when you talked about the double marginalization of Muslim women. First, by the patriarchy, Muslim patriarchy, and then by the society, which considered places within the category of Muslims. So now we move on to my dear friend, Dr. P.K. Yasser Arafat, whose scholarship I have long admired. He is assistant professor in the Department of History, and he's going to speak on wailing the whale and wheeling the whale. One is with W and the other is with B. Gender spaces, sartorial imaginations, and Malayala Islam in colonial Malabar. So he's going to look at something very important, something usually associated with the figure of Muslim women, which is sartorial choices. And Yasir, I would like to place before you, and maybe you will respond to it on your own. Recently, Professor Devji has published this book. You must have seen this essay about it, which is, I think, titled A Modern History of Muslim Gender in India, where he argues that during 19th century colonial time, Islam emerged as a protagonist, not as a set of beliefs. From the set of belief, Islam emerged as a protagonist in its own right, which had to be, as an actor, which had to be defended. So Muslim reformers came forward to defend Islam, but because they did not have sovereignty due to colonial rule, they associated, they themselves were, drawn to domestic sphere. So they associated it with Muslim women, and women became therefore the emblems of Islam. In another essay, he calls the exclamation of Islam, which I find very fascinating. They became emblems of Islam, and
This meeting is being recorded.
identity of a Muslim woman was placed or attached to her sartorial choices and comportment, right? Charam, haya, and so on and so forth. Then he says that in 20th century Islam once again has moved back to the notion of ideology or category of ideology, from being an actor or protagonist to ideology, and therefore Muslim women no longer have to refer to the authority of patriarchy or Islam to come to public sphere, and therefore their grammar has changed. Would you agree, disagree, or
Well, thank you, Nishat, and thank you everyone. I think I'm audible.
you'll have to put on the mic?
Yeah, I think get up. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Amina, for inviting me.
Over to you.
The essay on the my side is where the forthcoming book project I have. Um, and I'll start with a couple of contemporary issues that we are familiar with. Then I'll go back to the 19th century and the 17th century to kind of bring the historical fair into it. So I read a paper, and whenever necessary, I will try to explain. One of the most significant post-independence flashpoints surrounding the hijab emerged when a government-run pre-university college in Karnataka barred Muslim girls from wearing it, arguing that it contravened the institution's prescribed uniform. This move by the college administration prompted demonstration by school and pre-university students, along with the protests organized by various Muslim groups. However, these efforts achieved little, compelling the students to approach the court in the hope of overturning the ban. The Karnataka High Court nevertheless affirmed the authority of schools to enforce the state's ban, rejecting all major arguments advanced by the students. This had invoked the right to freedom of conscience, Article 25 of the Indian Constitution, as well as the right to free expression and privacy. The court rejected the first claim by ruling that wearing the hijab was not, quote unquote, an essential practice of Islam. For this latter point, it held that the uniform policy constituted a reasonable restriction that was court, religious, natural, and court, and universally applicable. The judges further asserted that the dress code upheld the principles of secularism. In 2025, just a month ago, I'm going to Kerala. The hijab dispute at St. Rita's Public School in Kochi. This is happening in Kochi, where a grade 8 Muslim student began wearing hijab. And the issue reveals the persistent friction between uniform policies, religious freedom, and minority rights in Kerala's educational institution. You can just Google notes now after the talk that the hijab controversy in Kerala. While the school insisted that hijab violated its long-standing dress code, the state government framed the refusal as a denial of secular education and an infringement of girls' dignity and privacy. The controversy was rapidly politicized, prompting Protestant temporary closure, and despite the minister's directive supporting her right, the student ultimately withdrew amid emotional distress, closing the case in court. But I situate this issue within a long genealogy of disputes over sartorial regulation, minority rights, and the politics of secular schooling in Kerala. Historically, questions of Muslim women's dress in the region have indexed broader anxieties about visibility, respectability, and communal belonging. The present conflict, though framed administratively as a matter of uniform discipline, reveals the persistent tension between a disciplinary secularism that privileges homogenization and constitutional forms of tolerance. The school's insistence on a rigid dress code rehearses an older pedagogical impulse in colonial and missionary institutions, where the production of a neutral public sphere was contingent upon the disciplining minority bodies and erasing embodied signs of difference. Conversely, the state intervention programs a race-based discourse that treats the hijab not as a communal assertion but an extension of bodily autonomy and gendered self-passion. The withdrawal of the student, despite governmental support, underscored the affective and psychological dimensions of institutional exclusion, where formal rights failed to compensate for everyday hostility. Kerala's history of Muslim reform, Muslim education, and debates on modesty from Sayyid Sanabullah Makki from the last part of the 18th century to 20th century Madrasa reforms shows that Sartorial politics have long been entitled to the question of morality, pedagogy, and citizenship. The current episode at St. Rita's Public School in Kochi is marked not an aberration, but a reiteration of structural tensions between state secularism and minority rights, between uniformity and multiculturalism, and between institutional authority and lived experience of Muslim girls navigating educational spaces in contemporary Kerala. One of the most significant discussions on this issue, not this issue, of course, related issues or such issues, feminist historians the feminist historian John Scott in a work, Politics of Wail, asked why the headscarf became intolerant and controversial in France. She argues that assimilation was the only way for Muslims to become French, for which the precondition was making Muslim women remove the hijab from public spaces such as schools. Unquote. Now I'll go back to the colonial history, 18th century, and a bit later earlier. I'm thinking it from the conceptual framework that I'm developing now, the vestimentary colonialism, that means to do with the dress and so on. So forth. One could see how European Orientalists attempt to fixate sartorial systems in their colonies 2 centuries ago. The framework will be useful to describe how colonial regimes controlled, reshaped, or stigmatized the clothing practices of colonized bodies, such as prescribing uniforms, banning indigenous attires, sexualizing or criminalizing fabrics, or imposing European sartorial norms as markers of civility and modernity. Muslim women who wore clothes that were identified sartorially as Islamic were specifically targeted in colonial medical, missionary, and administrative discourses. The main cause of the cultural, moral, cognitive fixation was Christian missionary orientalism, as I call it, which had the overreaching goal of proselytizing the East in order to redeem it. They depicted Muslim women in the 19th century as a group that was seen as homogeneous and unchanged. Muslim women were chiefly revealed for their quote unquote ignorance and gender suffering in the lack of a good savior like Jesus Christ. Thus, in a godly sense, Muslim women in South Asia looked permanently docile and passive carriers of imposed social and cultural dictators, remaining mute spectators for their lack of ability to claim a autonomous selfhood. In Orientalist discourses, the South Asian women lacked both literary agency and cognitive maturity for embodying undetachable irrationality, which traced back to their putative ethnological inferiority. From the racialized gender imaginations of the post-Renaissance travelers like Goethe, Barbarossa, Warsema, and so on and so forth, and ethnologists like Francis Palsrat to Thomas Correa to ethnographically trained colonial administrators like Edgar Thurston, William Logan, and so on and so forth, the women in South Asia were mutated as submissive, shrewd, sexually amorphous, morally egregious, politically uneducatable, and economically unproductive. Closer as the uninspiring demographic undesirables, South Asian women lacked life aspirations, quote unquote, life aspirations, social mobility, rational self identification, autonomous voice, and public secular interest. The 19th century missionary Orientalists, religious accounts, and other writings presented Muslim women as a section subject to multitude of rapid freezing, as I call it, in their own spatio-temporal location. They were mostly lost for their ignorance and gender suffering, as I said. So one of the such accounts, the Muhammadan women were slaves, and their suffering could not be conveyed in any single term. As conversion to Christianity was presented as the only viable instrument of salvation for Muslims in missionary Orientalist emancipatory narrative, the Christ emerged, as I mentioned, as the immediate and palpable savior of Muslim women, as he possessed the power to redeem them and transfigure their lives. The savior syndrome of missionary Orientalism became more intense in the 19th century. Those women who believed in Islamic law and followed the life of Prophet Muhammad were presented to have lost every strand of autonomy, making them on a level with the beast of burden, and no nation raises above the level of its women. This is coming from a book. The Orientalist writers viewed Muslim women as a forlorn group who had been immured forever in a living grave, and blamed Muhammad, the Prophet, for sweeping, quote unquote, away forever all hope of happiness for Muslim women. So this is coming from a 19th century description of British female writers who travel in Egypt. And the accounts actually becomes contradictory to her own depiction because she's also talking about Muslim women smoking and dancing and doing a lot of un-Islamic things in the streets. So what happened before modernity? In one of the notable studies on Muslim women as imagined in Western literary discourses, Moja Kar, our major scholars, demonstrate that she was not portrayed in literature of the Middle Ages wearing a veil and living alone. So you don't find this issue, sartorial, undesirable sartorial uh, issue with Muslim women in mid century literature. It is basically coming after the 16th century. So 1 second, sorry. So that this particular kind of sartorializing Muslim women or the sartorial undesirability related to Muslim women actually starts with the 17th century or 16th century, as I said. And the veil and the harem were introduced as the two permanent features in Muslim women's daily existence from the 16th century. According to a lot of feminist scholars, the rise of the top of the oppressed Muslim women coincided with the expansion of the British and French empires in the 19th century. So it has a political piece, it has a political piece. Because they have subjugated entire Muslim societies, these empires had a direct stake in portraying the Muslim women as oppressed, even as their policies oppressed real live Muslim women across the empires. Imperial writers suppressed the complex histories of the headscarves and ignored the reality that Muslim women's fashion choices were never uniform. Aside from the necessity to be concerned with modesty, a phrase that is interpreted differently depending on the period and circumstances. There were little homogeneity in Muslim women's attire across the world. As Islam became a worldwide religion, women became to be portrayed and lived in distinct ways under various Islamic regimes. Kerala, the Mapla or Malayala Islam. Sartorial conflicts and vestimentary regulations, specifically covering and uncovering, became a significant part of the theological discourse throughout the Indian Ocean and Mediterranean Islam in the 19th century. As the new reformist forces, the Muslim cosmopolitanism or pan-Islamism emerging in the ocean, across the ocean, and that was sweeping throughout the Muslim world. This is the context in which Ashraf Tanwi, I'm sure not even scholars here, pushed for the strict veiling in all situations, including marriages in his renowned work, which the server, one of the, as you know, one of the most prominent pietistic man produced in the 19th century. So I'm briefly touching upon the major scholars in the 19th century Kerala. Salawat Masfi. In fact, I mentioned it earlier. His position on Muslim women arose in response to the persistent accusations by Christian missionaries who denounced Islam and the Prophet Muhammad for the supposed backwardness of Muslim women education. These critiques, which contrasted Islamic gender norms with Western notions of female emancipation, were internalized within the Muslim intelligentsia of Kerala as anxieties about women's inefficiency. It was in this polemical context that Mufti Sayyid Sanallah Makti undertook to prove the three Purusha Dharma, that is the terminology he uses in his all of his works, the moral order of men and women, and thereby establish the glory of Islam. So in one of this forthcoming work which I mentioned earlier, I'm kind of considering Makti as the first uh, decolonial scholar, reformist decolonial scholar from Kerala. So that's a different argument altogether. I'm not going there. Makti refusing to dignify Islamophobic critique with engagement, advances a striking inversion of civilizational narrative, Western reformism, and he insists is historically posterior to Islam. making Islam its true reform guru, that means Parishkara Guru. Drawing from the John Davenport's An Apology for Muhammad in the Quran. So I'll take 2 minutes. Sure. Uh, so this is the book is referring to continuously his works in the 19th century. And you will be amazed to know that the person who is writing sitting in Kerala, and of course, you know the pre-technology, pre-telegraph, I'm sorry, all kinds of technology that we have. It's actually, referring to more than 150 books written in different languages that include German, French, and so on and so forth. That means, in fact, it's kind of, you know, drawing all kinds of what you say knowledge circulating in the notion and so on and so forth. So drawing from John Davenport's An Apology for Muhammad's in Quran, Makti forcefully argues that foundational epistemic traditions, particularly philosophy and sciences, rationality, entered Europe through the intellectual labor of the Moors or the barbarians. At a time when Europe itself remained enveloped in darkness. His citations on John Lawrence Mosheim, in the 18th century German Lutheran church historian, is also reading him, translating. Amazing kind of a work. In fact, if you're interested, you can read fortunately English translations, but Malayali students I can see a couple of places. So further consolidate this revisionist kind of historiography. Makti highlights Mosheim's acknowledgement that Muslims established institutions of learning in regions such as Italy and Spain precisely when what you call the whole of Europe was in extreme darkness. Unquote. Through this counter-historical strategy, Makti performs what might be termed an epistemic reversal. He destabilizes the Eurocentric temporal hierarchy that positions Europe as perennial teacher and Islam as its belated pupil. In doing so, he questions the moral and intellectual authority of Europe, the alleged discipline to disciple, to sermonize Muslims on women's education or morality. For Makti, such critiques are historically untenable. For the very categories of knowledge, science, philosophy, and reform that Europe now wields as civilizational markers were to tendencies originally illuminated by Islamic intellectual. Positioning Islam as the reformist Lord, the Lord of Reformation, Parishkara Prabhu, Bhakti envisions a divinely ordained social order in which married women remain under care and protection of their husbands, whose authority is rendered both natural and moral. Women, he insists, must depend on their husband and remain beyond the gaze of man outside their kinship circle. When we look at Makti now, in fact, we can definitely feel that he is a classic misogynist. But okay, so we have to read the text and the writings from a particular context, and the context here is, as I said, Christian missionary evangelism and other kinds, sorry, missionary orientalism and so on and so forth. Of course, I'm not justifying that is not my idea. Okay, it's complex, layered. Yet within this framework, Makti also underscores women's access to both religious or worldly knowledge, which they are to acquire under the supervision of parents and teachers. The entire family thus becomes collectively responsible for a woman's moral, intellectual, and sartorial formation from childhood. To conclude, from the from the early 20th century, the hijab's meaning, shape, and trend continued to evolve. Anthropologists from the colonial era perceived it as a humanizing object. In the 1940s, the hijab was seen as an anti-West and pious object in places like Egypt. Following the decline of the Muslim Brotherhood in the 1960s, they vanished once more. In Iran, women began to wear the hijab in the 1970s, but in most of the South Asia, it was only simply covering for Muslim women who ventured outside. It was since the early 90s that headscarves became the visible sartorial trend in many Islamic societies in South Asia, and countries like India witnessed a growing trend along with the global war on terrorism, which uncovered the dominant Islamophobia in many places. Laila Ahmed identifies several factors that led to neo-hijabi women claiming their sartorial identity in many countries in the West Africa and Asia. The motivations included anti-sexism, minority justice, vaccine prejudices, and fair treatment. in addition to gender justice. Thus, the meaning of the hijab is neither uniform, nor does it have a single history of religious affiliation, and Muslim women's justification for wearing it having evolved over time. Last one minute, Nishan, I'm sorry, maybe 30 seconds. So, when I was doing my field work in Kerala back in 2016 or 17, I guess. So, you'll be amazed to know the kind of reasons Muslim women wear parda or hijab or whatever you might say. In fact, I listed 40 reasons. I'll just read out 10 of them and I'll conclude. Uh, so it is very easy during pregnancy. That is one of the reasons, major reasons. Right? Uh, and it is economical, you know, at work, it is very easy. And it doesn't bring economic burden. And it is, I mean, with fathers and this thing, it is easy to breastfeed. It is easy to evade gates, and it is useful to save money, and it is an emergency dress. And out of this 160 women I interviewed, 10 of them said it is useful to save current charge. That means you don't have to wash it as you
can have a bad hair day.
and also pressing. And it also increases sibling love. That if you have sisters, they can change, they can wear. And so of course you know the story, right? And there are of course serious reasons like piety, protest, and so on and so forth. 40 reasons I just read out 12 of them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yasser, for this very, very interesting presentation on hijab, the many meanings of hijab, the historical trajectory of the sartorial rules, sartorial choices imposed on women, especially during the colonial rule, and looking at it in the context of hijab. That was fascinating, and we are looking forward to your monograph. Hopefully to counter also, not just to Right. So we move on to Dr. Jane Borker. She is with the Department of Social Work, and she has done her PhD on this subject. This is related to your PhD. Fascinating, Haim. So Haim has done her PhD from University of Oxford, and she is currently teaching here in the faculty. She's going to speak on rethinking gender and agency, educational journeys of Muslim girls in a madrasa. Okay. Thank you so much. And I mean, honestly, it's truly an honor to be part of the panel because I think to get any sort of recognition from amongst your peers and colleagues is the greatest honor. So thank you, Professor Zaidi. Thank you, Amina. Thank you to the entire Sarojini Naidu Center. I was right across the corridor for several years, but this is truly the first time I'm speaking on this forum. So, with a bad throat, but a very open heart, very grateful. I have just because I'm aware of the fact that I'm keeping everyone from lunch. I have just changed track. I have a full paper ready, but I think I'm going to begin with a story. That's why I just opened my laptop because I think that it's been a long, long morning. So, you just bear with me. I'll try and sum this up and just present my argument to the PPT. But before that, I'll read a little story to you. This is from my doctorate, and it's from Jamia. At that time, I never knew that I'll end up teaching here one day. So, in February of a cold winter morning, my search for university students who studied in a madrasa led me for probably the 100th time to the faculty of Urdu, Arabic, and Islamic studies, where I was told that a lot of girl madrasa graduates study. And that is how I came for the first time to Jamia because it recognizes madrasa degrees. And I had located 7 such students from attendance register, but I had not managed to interview even one. And I think if anybody is a scholar here, you know how it feels. So that afternoon, one of the lady teachers told me that one of the third year students who was studying Arabic and was from a madrasa background had made a rare appearance for the morning class. And if I was lucky, I could just catch her in time for the evening class. And that is how I met the 22-year-old Fatima. It's a pseudonym. For the first time, she was really tall.
in a busy corridor, only her eyes visible below the niqab. And I really tried to explain to her, I'm doing my PhD, I'm doing it from abroad. I really tried to look for you. Can you please give me your interview? And she just gazed at me. I felt like a salesperson, but her gaze was calm. And she said, "What is it that you want? आपको मेरा interview करना है, मैं आपको अपना interview दे देती हूँ." And she was my first interviewee amongst the Madrasa graduates, and I think this was her story. Her only request was that can the interview, because all of us are familiar with Jamia, take place in the garden and not in the classroom. So I thought that was a bit of an odd request. So she says that I'm the only girl in class and everything I do is scrutinized, or maybe it's all in my mind. That is why I come here half an hour early and I walk into an empty classroom. Otherwise, it's like 40 eyes are following me. So Fatima and I settled ourselves on the very last bench in the garden. If any of you have seen the department, it's across the road. And so she said, visibly, seeing that she was visibly ill at ease, I said, do the boys in your class follow you? And do they bother you? And she just said, no, don't get me wrong. They're very sharif. They don't trouble me or anything. It's just that I feel very conspicuous in all this. And I think it's strange that people feel that, a lot of women feel that people don't notice you in one of your mentioned reasons. But it's like, in fact, she's citing the example of a kabutar, which I've not mentioned. She said kabutar closes the eyes, but still everybody is looking. So, and she went on that it's not easy being the only girl in class. One stands out. In the first year, there was just one more girl. Then she got married, so she left, and I started missing classes because I was not allowed to attend. But then somehow my teacher said that you can come, just even if you give the exams, it will be fine. So I took some notes from a boy in my class, and that's how I passed the exams. And now I am in my second year. She said that being in Jamia was very, very important to her. And to highlight the importance of this hard earned trust, she said, being here is a big thing for me. With God's grace, I'm the first girl in my entire Khandan to go to college. I'm the youngest among 6 brothers and sisters. All my brothers have done their graduation here, but girls in our family don't study. My mother is illiterate. She never went to school. My 2 elder sisters studied in the same madrasa as me. One has gotten married. The other is waiting to get married. I am my father's favorite, just like Hazrat Fatima, my namesake, was our Prophet's favorite. I begged my father to let me study here, and finally, after a year, he allowed, and that's why I'm here. Fatima's father is from Bijnor, a town in Western UP. He's an Ansari. His whole family has been in the timber business for decades. Just don't scroll. I'll just tell you. Thank you. He shifted to Delhi in the 1990s, and soon after Fatima was born, their family moved up on the ladder. Fatima studied in an Urdu medium school till class 5, but after finishing her primary school, her parents admitted her to Jamia Niswan, a girls' madrasa, where both her elder sisters were studying before her. I asked her, how come all the girls in your family studied in the same madrasa? And her father had gone to a private, and the brothers went to a private school. She said, there are many pabandis, many restrictions in our family. We are the first generation of girls to actually go to any place to study. My father thought we should study a little, but he preferred the madrasa to admitting us to a school. I don't know exactly why he did it, because we don't ask him these sort of questions. No one does. But I think it's because we shifted to Delhi and there were 5 children to go to school. I was the smallest baby, so well, I was not included. We did not have the money we have today then. My father did not know a lot of people. Koi salah mashwara karne ke liye nahi tha is the term she used. And then we found out that this Jamia Niswan is safe for girls, and that's how I went. She said about her journey, I love studies. I went to the masjid to study the Quran, and Maulvi Saab told my father that inka zehen bahut acha hai. I was small, I would keep looking at my brother's books and I would take a chalk and keep writing on the walls. My father knew that I wanted to study, and that's how I went to Jamia Niswan. But the moment the mention of Jamia Niswan would come up, she would always, Fatima would make a point to qualify that this was more like a school. It was just a madrasa name only. It's affiliated with CBSE. We learn English there. It has an Alima course, but it's like all the other courses. And she was very proud that it was not like a typical madrasa, because the girls are engaged in debating, ghazal singing, naat recitation, shairi, so on and so forth. So I asked her, what do you think is the difference between this and the other school? And she said that the difference is one of the mahal. schools don't offer dini taaleem. They don't stress on parda. They don't tell you the difference between haram and halal. This is all that we get from madrasa, and we also get regular schooling. Comparing herself to the classmates from regular schools in Jamia itself, she said, all of last year, my brother would come pick me and drop me, even though we just stay 5 minutes away. I would see other girls traveling by the Delhi metro. They are not hesitant. मैं मेट्रो में जाती हूँ तो मैं बिल्कुल झुंझुना जाती हूँ. So Fatima was quick to add that it is the worldly knowledge is very important, but so is the dini taaleem. The only shortcoming she felt in the girls' madrasas was that they didn't expect much from their students. उनसे मतलब उनकी बहुत उम्मीदें नहीं थी. They just feel girls should get married into a दीनदार घर. That's why girls from the madrasa बस दीनी ही होके रह जाती. And so I'm going to skip a few sentences, skip a few parts, and then I asked her, so how was Jamia for her? So she told me कि आप ही बताइए. Everyone says कि admission form internet से ले लीजिए. ये form भर के आप यहाँ पे आ जाइए. She's like, for girls like me who come from my type of background, I need a lot of help to avail these opportunities. The first year I came to Jamia, I did not understand a word. Our teacher grew up in Saudi Arabia and speaks, I'm sure she did, but that's what she said, and speaks Arabic like the Arabs. Most of the boys in class are very fluent in Arabic too, because they come from a madrasa background. But the academic rigor in boys' madrasa and girls' madrasa may be different. But I speak better English than the boys in our class. That's for sure. She said that I always feel a little hesitant. Kahin main kuch galat sawal na de do. But then the teachers encourage me. Now I'm in my last year. I asked her what are the other dilemmas she faces. She said it's the boys in class. You remember that she told me we want to sit in the last. So I said, what do you mean? I was thinking the worst. She said, nothing, nothing. It's just that they say things when I enter the class. They start giggling, they drop books, and they pass remarks like, wow, Zabardast, mashallah. The other day, one of them had the audacity to tell me, kya peace hai? I really lost my temper and told him, just because I'd come to study doesn't give somebody the right to disrespect me. My family is very strict. The idea of boys and girls studying together is dangerous. They feel scared. What if I cross the line? मैंने बड़ी मुश्किल से अपनी एक इमेज बनाई है कि मैं एक खामोश लड़की हूँ. मैं हूँ नहीं खामोश. मैंने ऐसी इमेज बनाई है कि कोई मेरे से आके बात ना करे. And that's because I feel कि जिस भरोसे के साथ घर वालों ने मुझे यहाँ पे भेजा है वो बना रहे. So I asked her that time I had not come to Jamia. I was still much younger, like almost a decade younger. So I asked her, do you have any friends who are boys? And the moment I asked the question, I regretted it. But she replied, she said, I do, just one person. I said, okay, he's very decent. And I only got talking to him because you remember I had to take the notes from him in the first year when the only other girl in class left. I said, yes, I remember. So then she said, आपको कुछ मुझसे और पूछना है. तो मैंने कहा नहीं, that's fine. And then we walked across the garden, back to her faculty, and she said, you know that friend, he wants to marry me. I said, oh, great. Do you want to marry him too? And she said, she became very quiet, and she said, if anything was to happen, even marriage, which is the best case scenario, the small window that is open to girls' education in my family would close. जो छोटा सा जरिया बना है वो भी बंद हो जाएगा. And so this is the story of my first visit to Jamia and the story that I will tell you about Jamia. This is much before joining Jamia. I think this is what brought me to Jamia. So my study is on girls' madrasas, and I think in many ways Fatima's story tells us that why girls' madrasas are important, but in very many different ways to the different actors who come here. So for the parents who face a lot of double binding choices, girls' madrasas emerge as an option because parents want to educate their girls, but not over-educate them. There's a place where it's not co-educational, it's a parda institution. Not just wearing parda, but a parda institution where there's segregation, where there is acceptance for certain type of clothing, and it is an extension in terms of the family, in terms of safety, where there's of course both dini taaleem and dunyavi taaleem. For the institutions provide this extremely consumable package, particularly girls' madrasas, of education. If you could scroll down, so in the brochures, just before this, in the brochure, this is the madrasa where I did my field work. I spent a year teaching English here. This was for my doctoral work. So this is actually sort of broadcast in the brochures itself that, this is a Parda institution. It's extremely fenced. Girls are very safe here. And the Parda is not just in terms of safety, but also in protection from men, protection from corrupting influences like TV, music, mobile phone. And there is often a comparison made to the immodest school-going girls. There are strict sort of institutional routines which are reflected. Can you go to the previous slide, please? I just prefer one. Yeah. But for the girls, and this is the larger argument that I make, and which is what I'll straight away be coming to, that for the girls, the madrasa represents a space. It does not represent exactly what the parents want. It does not represent exactly what the girls, what the institution wants. But the girls themselves have managed to carve out a sort of space of high self-action. They understand and articulate madrasa norms as wanting to become a Ba'amal alima, but this is embodied very differently. And for this, I draw on, I think the previous speaker, Professor Abidi, also mentioned, I draw on Sabah Mahmood's work, who works on the Egyptian mosque movement and talks about self-passionate. तो बहुत ही अच्छा example देती हैं pianist का कि एक जो pianist wants to play a piano, he or she has to subject themselves to the discipline, get up in the morning, follow a certain routine, and play the piano. And that is how they become a pianist. So she says, in many ways, what she saw in the Egyptian mosque movement was the girls exercising their agency through this self passion, through trying to fashion themselves in this manner. And in many ways, I found initially, particularly in my days in the madrasa, it resonating in this way with what I saw. So the girls would go forward, please. Trying to fashion themselves as a Ba'amal Alima. But as I started spending more time, so I by and large agree with Sabah Mahmood's argument, but I sort of offer a bit of a corrective to it that this bias self-fashioning that girls do and carry out is not so watertight. It's not as tight, it's not as absolute, it's not as complete. And these are some of the examples that I found. One was the example of, could you go forward, please? So if you play this, this is the Independence Day in the Madrasa, and the girls were asked to. Oh, it has no volume. People could hear it in the morning. So this was the Madrasa where I did my fieldwork. But in the morning it was playing. Okay, that's fine. But so basically, the girls are singing. They were asked to prepare a skit on Independence Day, and their mothers have only come to attend this. And they are saying, they prepared this entire skit, and they said, "Kaum agar tum saath na do, to tanha humse kya hoga?" And they prepared this entire skit for their mothers. On the occasion of Independence Day. And this is in the aftermath of the Nirbhaya gang rape case. So you can see the black bands that they're wearing. And this is very contrary to the imagery that Madrasa mein, there'll be no singing. In fact, if you can, it is a very nice, if the song can come, we can see it probably later. Okay. And is it possible? Oh, it's not paying. Oh, that's fine. So there were a lot of such incidents that I found. This was one of them. The other was that games were not allowed in the madrasa because it was a very constrained space, and if the informal curriculum was कि लड़कियों को जंगली नहीं बनना है, जंगली की तरह act नहीं करना है. But the girls would go on the terrace जब वो कपड़े सुखाने जाती थी अपने. This was a residential girls madrasa, and they would play games. And I have put a picture in the next slide of that. If you could go to the next slide. And the girls are playing, and they would, even the badminton nets they did not have, so वो अपने आप ही they would make a human badminton net to play badminton. And they would often say कि कुरान में कहाँ लिखा है कि खेलना मना है. And the other example was छज्जे में लटकना. This is their farewell में these girls very silently walking off the stage, and then they had their own confetti party. जिसका मैंने एक picture लिया. And so what I basically argue is that this is for the picnic at Lodi Garden, where of course the parda had to be followed, but the different class girls made their own dress code, and they were very excited about this. And yeah. So what is it that I argue? I basically say that religious education in the madrasa emerges as a paradoxical resource through very everyday negotiations, which are very, very subtle. Sometimes girls challenge, sometimes they also reinforce the norms, but in some ways they're reconfiguring what it means to participate in public space. And there are new possibilities for mobility and change that do emerge. This is from the lawns in Jamia, which I have picked out an image because I didn't have any field visits in my fieldwork. That the policy push for integration of madrasa students into higher education creates avenues like for Fatima, like some of the other girls. Um, there are a lot of first generational learners who are coming into the space, possibilities of negotiating to delay marriage because madrasas are often seen as very safe parking spaces. कि बड़ी बहन की शादी नहीं हो रही, छोटी लड़की को कहाँ भेजे, मदरसा में भेजते हैं, भाई की शादी नहीं हो रही, कहाँ भेजे, बच्ची की अपनी शादी नहीं हो रही, घर पे रखना सेफ नहीं है तो मदरसा में भेज दीजिए. But the point is the way girls use these opportunities are very different, like I have said. And these become possibilities for mobility. These become possibilities for changing certain norms, but in a circumscribed way, with certain outer boundaries. And if you could move to the next slide, there's a recent, so I've talked about this. I talked about this in a recent work which has come out in the December of 2023, Amina Hussain, who writes in the context of Iran, and she talks about housing. It's of course a very different context because it's a majority Islamic context. Talks about exactly very similar negotiations that women carry out, where they in fact participate in Islamic seminaries to show themselves as religious and then to claim positions of political authority because that legitimacy. I think that is at a very higher scale, but we definitely see that in a very micro, everyday way, even in India. And last slide, please. And there are some recent scholarship that is coming out of India also, which talks about public piety as a form of assertion of making space for women in a place in non-Muslim environments. I think a lot of people have mentioned Shaheen Bagh, dressing up like what you mentioned from 1990. There was change in the grammar and the vocabulary of how you want to appear Muslim in a performative way in public space to sort of talk about, and a lot of authors see it as an assertion to say that, India is not only Hindu and, Muslim women have the right to participate in public space and a way of asserting that space. So I'm going to stop here and very open for questions and thank you.
Wonderful. We had a brilliant panel. I mean, all three presentations were absolutely fascinating. I'm sure there must be many questions, not that we have a lot of time for them, but still, if you have some questions, shoot.
Thank you for brilliant presentation. You also talked about how they reinforce the ideals that the Madrasa were taught to them. Which you also see women doing a lot in public spaces themselves, self-correcting
Yes.
behavior that we're almost used to. And I wanted to, if you could just explore a little about how this reinforcement takes place within the.
So this is what I all sort of bring out in my larger work. Often there is a lot of peer learning that happens in the madrasa. The evening जो पूरे हल्का होता है वो सब senior girls lead करती हैं. In fact, the teachers in the madrasa are also just graduates just passed out a year or 2 years before. And so when I initially went to the madrasa because it was a new environment for me also. Uh, it was, they would like point out, oh, आपका दुपट्टा ठीक नहीं है and the hair is visible and you're not sitting properly and आपने अगर transparent या वो सितारों वाला दुपट्टा लगाया है तो फिर इसमें पर्दा करने का फायदा ही क्या है, and these sort of things were like a lot of this sort of thing was coming out initially, but then later on I realized that it is the same girls who then ensure that the teachers, there are only 8 teachers to manage 600 girls. There's a big disproportion in the number. जब वो ऊपर टेनिस मतलब बैडमिंटन खेलने जा रहे हैं तो बाहर से ताला लगाना, so the girls were also in groups. And another thing that I mentioned is that खासकर वहाँ पे थोड़ा अजीब सा फिनोमेना था जो मुझे बहुत ऑलमोस्ट 1 साल बाद पता चला कि वहाँ पे सबकी तबीयत बहुत ज्यादा खराब होती थी. And so the तबीयत खराब होना was the reason to go out. Okay. So because it was a very police environment, and these elder students were in on it. क्योंकि अब 8 टीचर हैं, 600 बच्चे हैं, आप क्लास में आप पढ़ा रहे हैं, किसी की तबीयत खराब हो गई, तो there would be some girls ready at hand कि अच्छा तुम ले जाओ उनको, so and they all had this sort of a little, just very friendly, there's nothing untowardly. And that is because in the farewell, a lot of girls presented each other pictures, pictures, and pictures are not generally allowed. And also, where would you get the pictures from? Because there's no camera, no mobile phone allowed. So this sort of illness and doctor visits became a reason. So there was a very, both sides you could see. So one was reinforcing, which was a very, the taught aspect of it, and one was the friendship groups, which were also forming. And in fact, I have to say one was this thing which I've written in my doctorate. The Madrasa had a computer lab, but the computer lab had no internet. So a lot of girls had no way to prepare for exams. But in the library of the Madrasa, I have seen the most meticulously prepared, what should I say, farra तो नहीं कहूँगी मैंने कुंजी टाइप का for the class 10 English, class 12 board exams, because वहाँ बहुत सारी लड़कियाँ open से देती थी, and that was the friendship and the strength of the relationship and the hard work that girls put in there. That वो जो पास आउट होता था, वो अपने से पहले वाले के लिए वो पूरे नोट्स बना के लाइब्रेरी में जमा करके जाता था. So without internet, that they could make these transitions. So that is the strength that that I observed.
Kind of solidarity.
Solidarity, forming of solidarity in a constrained environment. And this, I saw a lot of madrasa girls. I don't know बाकी जगह होता है कि नहीं, but I find it hard to believe कि मेरा यूनिवर्सिटी में एडमिशन हो और कोई और आके बोल रहा है नहीं आपको जरूर जाना चाहिए, मैं इनका ख्याल रखूंगी. So that was a very big, I mean, the solidarity and the friendship in the madrasa is very close.
So, I'm wondering what it led